All right, here we go. It's May 4th, 1999, smack dab in the middle of NATO's Operation Allied Force over Kosovo. Most fighter pilots at the time thought the dense surface-to-air missile network, the integrated air defense system, was their greatest threat. Point in case, Serbian surface-to-air missiles had fired over 700 missiles at our boys. In fact, a few days prior, NATO had lost a jet to a surface-to-air missile battery. But on this day, the real surprise came from a Serbian MiG-29. That MiG-29 was attempting to intercept a NATO strike package during the egress. But at the center of all this was Lieutenant Colonel Michael Dog Geczy, who was leading a force-ship of F-16s in a high-stakes encounter that highlights the unpredictability of modern warfare. Today, we're diving into the air-to-air shoot-down from the tail end of the 20th century, the last one, in fact, of the U.S. military for over 20 years. So if you're new here and you like this type of content, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And today, let's jump into the last shoot-down of the 20th century. To really appreciate this story, we need to know the man in the cockpit. And today, that's Lieutenant Colonel Michael Dog Geczy. He graduated from Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training at Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas in 1983. Upon completing graduation, he moved on to the F-4E, flying that for about 2 years before converting to the F-16C, conducting one operational assignment at Ramstein Air Force Base. Dog would later go on to graduate from the United States Air Force Fighter Weapons School, or Top Gun, in 1992. He had multiple combat deployments in Iraq and Bosnia and racked up over 2,300 flight hours in F-16C, including the Block 15, 30, 42, and Block 50, before deploying to Aviano Air Base in support of Operation Allied Force. This MiG-29 kill occurred on his 115th combat mission and its 7th mission supporting Operation Allied Force. Geczy was assigned the 78th Fighter Squadron, the Bushmasters, which deployed from Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, and was about 3 weeks into the war as part of NATO's Force Structure Plus-Up. His aircraft for this fateful day was an F-16CJ, a Wild Weasel, Block 50, serial number 91053, which is near and dear to my heart, as that became assigned to the 77th Fighter Squadrons, the Gamblers that he would later command, and ultimately become the flagship. So if you see that in Change of Commands, if you play DCS, you'll see tail number 91353 still to this day, with the green star painted on it for that MiG kill from Dog. On that day, he led a force-ship, call sign Puma 11. His wingman, First Lieutenant D-Ball Austin, was about 350 hours in the jet and on his 3rd contingency deployment. His number 3 was led by Haji Julizea, an instructor pilot with about 1,200 hours and on his 8th combat deployment. His number 4 was Nut Peterson, who was a critical link on that day. And although Nut was flying in a wingman position, he was actually a qualified flight lead and actually in the instructor upgrade program and eventually would go on to weapons school. The flight that day was called a force protection mission, an escort mission. Basically, they're going to go out there and protect the strikers so they can go in and do their work and get out safely. They're loaded up with a variety of armament to handle both air-to-air threats and air-to-ground threats. Each jet is carrying 2 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, or HARMs, 2 AIM-120 AMRAAMs, the advanced medium-range air-to-air missile, radar-guided missiles there, and 2 AIM-9 Mike Sidewinders, IR-guided missiles. A full load of 20 Mike, which is not too much in the Mighty Viper. I'll give you that. 510 rounds at 6,000 rounds a minute. It goes pretty quick, as well as a slew of self-protection assets, including external jamming pod on the center line, chaff flare, and towed decoys. So today, let's break down those threats and what they're doing. The HARMs, those are the large white missiles that are mounted under the wings next to the fuel tanks. They're big old missiles. Again, the HARM stands for high-speed anti-radiation missile. It's designed to go against surface-to-air missile radar sites. Radar emissions that are emitting from a radar site, well, it's going to sniff those out and go after them. This allows the pilot to suppress enemy air defenses from a distance while protecting the strike aircraft, taking out the radar sites so that they're blind and they can't threaten you anymore. Block 50 F-16s are also configured with a HARM targeting system, an HTS pod. This allows him to sniff out those radar sites and more effectively target and maneuver around these radar sites so that, again, they can take them out and protect the strikers or themselves. Now for the air-to-air piece, the wingtip missiles, those are AIM-120 AMRAAMs, radar guided, beyond visual range for air-to-air engagements. They also carry AIM-9 Mikes, shorter range, infrared missiles. Those are on the inboard stations, also mounted underneath the wings. And then you got the old trusty 20 Mike Gatling gun when it's time to get in close in the phone booth for a knife fight. Their job is to protect the strikers from both air threats and ground threats on that. It's a dual role. and its showcase is just a capability of the F-16. Now, the Block 50 is predominantly focused on SEAD, suppression of enemy air defense missions. However, they're ready for whatever comes their way. Operation Allied Force was NATO's campaign to halt the ethnic violence in Kosovo, compelling Yugoslav forces to withdraw through airstrikes on military targets. Fighter pilots of that day, who I think will all say that Serbian surface-air missile battery crews were well trained and they were pretty good at what they were doing. They got pretty creative with their tactics, sometimes becoming very unpredictable. They fired over 700 SAMs at NATO aircraft during the course of the war. And the Serbian military had been watching NATO operations over Bosnia for about 6 years at this point, so they were quick to modify their tactics and adjust to what NATO aircraft were doing. And at this point in the conflict, the air threat had been rather minimal for the past 7 weeks, although there were numerous shootdowns. And Dog will say his biggest concern on that day was in fact the SAM operators. But as it would turn out, he was dead wrong, as it ended up being a MiG-29 that was trying to catch the tail end Charlie during the egress of the strike package. On this day, NATO was actually conducting some of its first daylight strikes in central Serbia. Everyone's favorite, daylight, right? This was occurring near Belgrade. There were 2 flights of 4 F-16CJs, each dedicated to protect, escort, strike package. Puma 1 was assigned to escort strike package Alpha, consisting of Dutch, British, and French strikers. After they protected that strike package, the plan was to refuel and then cover strike package Charlie. Weather was definitely a huge factor on that day. Clouds were layered from the surface all the way up to 30,000 feet, making visibility really tough, as well as finding clear air to CAB, do their combat air patrol. The British and the Dutch aborted their attacks due to poor weather conditions on that day, but the French, call sign Knife 6-1, they pressed on and they requested actually additional time on station to drop all their ordnance. Geczy agreed to their additional time on station, but fuel was definitely getting tight. Always tight in the old Viper. And up until this point, it had been a relatively quiet mission. They'd done some preemptive SAM hunting with no shots fired, but as they began egressing to the west out of enemy airspace, heading home, that's when the real action started. On their egress, the AWACS controller started to make some radio calls about a bogey, additional radio calls about beyond visual range rules of engagement, which Dog will say again was pretty confusing, and he was trying to sort that out in his head while worrying about fuel and covering the strikers on their egress. He coordinated with Panther 2-1, the other 4 ship of F-16s, to try and get their radars looking down track where the enemy or the bogey threat had popped up. But they were quite a ways back from Dog's 4 ship and their radars rather limited. As they worked the egress, the AWACS controller came on and made a bogey call, which Dog will admit that he missed. It was actually Nut, his number 4, that chimed in on interflight, calling out the bogey. With Nut's SA building comm, Dog turned the 4 ship around in a wall formation to point towards the threat. The AWACS was making calls about rules of engagement that honestly were quite confusing to Dog. Dog coordinated with Panther 2-1 to try and get them to turn the other 4 ship of F-16s that was out there to look down track and get their radars on the enemy aircraft. Again, they were ways back, so the radar's rather limited as far as what it can see and how much they would be able to affect and help the fight. Dog was sorting a lot of things in his cockpit, from the low fuel state, determine if he would actually be able to successfully complete the engagement. They needed to roll their bingo to Sarajevo if they couldn't hit the tanker on the exit. The rules of engagement, again, which were quite confusing. There's a lot going on here as he's trying to run the intercept on this MiG-29 that's popped up. They climbed into the 30s, driving into a known surface-air missile threat zone. Not really what you want, but that is what it is. Now, as a fighter pilot, some of the things you're thinking about, is this a SAMbush? Is there an enemy aircraft that's drawing me into a surface-air missile engagement zone, the MES? You want to jettison your external fuel tanks, which they forgot to do. Again, the fog of war and the chaos that happens with it. The AWACS declared this MiG-29 hostile 7 times. Also, the MiG-29 illuminated Dog with his radar. These are all things he can use to build for hostile intent to meet per the rules of engagement to engage this aircraft. Now he's battling the rules of engagement, making sure he's good to go, managing the 4 ship as well as managing their fuel state, which remember they stayed on station for the French fighters to attack multiple times. They're pretty skosh on gas, so he's running through that in his head, like, can they make it? Do they need to change their divert location to Sarajevo? Can they make it to Sarajevo in the event that they complete this engagement? And then can't make it to a tanker. Now, as you might imagine too, again, working through the lawyer of this and making sure that the rules of engagement are met. Those are playing through Dog's head. He tries to get Panther 2-1, the other 4-ship of F-16s, to assist, get their radars pointing down track to help build some situational awareness, but they're a good ways behind, and the radars really are of no help at this point. The range closed faster than Dog wanted. It was beyond visual range initially, but definitely not quite where he wanted to be. But he fired 2 AMRAAMs in rapid succession. If you're going to fire one, you might as well fire 2 if it's that important. The missiles arced sharply, driving right through the HUD field of view. It felt like an eternity for those missiles to come off the rail. Dog just kind of remembers how impressive it was to see those AMRAAMs maneuvering in that high-G, high-speed environment to square the corner and strike the enemy MiG below. Thinking he might be the only one to see this and witness it, he made sure he rolled up to look at the maneuvering MiG below, just in time to see the explosion and the MiG careen out of the sky. He called out Splash 1 twice for emphasis. D-Ball Austin watched both missiles also impact, seeing the MiG execute a defensive beam maneuver last minute as it broke apart and fell from the sky. Radar tape also confirmed the direct hit, debunking any notions that friendly SAM engagement from the Serbians actually shot down one of their own. The Serbian pilot was later identified as Lieutenant Colonel Milenko Pavlik, commander of the 204th Fighter Aviation Wing, and he had taken off on that day to defend his hometown against NATO formations. A courageous but ultimately doomed effort in his case. He ejected from the aircraft, but he did not survive it. Post-shootdown, Puma 1-1 flight turned to egress back to the west, climb up to go find a tanker, only to find that their tanker had moved and was actually 100+ miles further than they anticipated. Strike Package Charlie, which were they then supposed to support after refueling, ultimately canceled due to weather. So with extra gas, some clean jets, Dog and his 4-ship went supersonic back to Aviano. They went up tactical initial, what every fighter pilot wants to do. However, he does admit it was probably a little risky that day because of all the rain, but they're pretty excited about it. When he got into D-arm at the end of the runway, his crew chief asked, "How'd it go?" Which he responded with, "Pretty good." Shot down a MiG. The place erupted. As you might imagine, those D-arm crews were pretty excited to see those AMRAAMs empty and knowing that they were successfully employed. Dog later also credits his formation with just the discipline that followed. There was no cowboy radio calls. It was clean, pristine, and by the book. Later in an interview, Dog says, I'm sure the equipment, the poor aircraft serviceability, the lousy Soviet-era style training that the Serbs went through, all was a factor for that MiG-29 pilot to get shot down. The F-16CJs they were flying were full up rounds, 100% mission capable, ready to go, all the equipment working, and he attributes that a lot to his success that day. He also says there definitely were decisions and tactics he would have done differently if he had to go over and do the mission again that day, and that any of his flight members could have ended up with that MiG-29 kill. Geczy went on to command the 77th Fighter Squadron, and tail number 91353 became the squadron flagship, which it is still to this day. This is a great story from Operation Allied Force, which again reminds us just how the routine can quickly escalate into a chaotic fury. Thanks for tuning in. If you like more of this content, make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you next time.